You're bringing your daughter to a blind date? The question rang across the elegant restaurant so sharply that even the pianist missed a note. Conversations faded into uneasy silence as every pair of eyes drifted toward the modest man standing beside the hostess. Ethan Brooks glanced down at the little girl clutching his hand before looking back at the stunning woman waiting by the window table. Charlotte Sinclair was exactly what the matchmaking profile had described: graceful, intelligent, and impossibly elegant. Her tailored ivory suit fit like it had been designed for royalty, and the diamond watch resting lightly on her wrist was worth more than Ethan's entire workshop. She looked at him, then at the little girl, then back again, clearly wondering whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Ethan offered an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry. My babysitter canceled an hour ago." He gently squeezed his daughter's hand. "I could have canceled too, but I figured breaking one promise today was enough." Charlotte folded her arms. Most men would have. Most fathers probably shouldn't. His answer carried no challenge, no embarrassment, only quiet certainty. The little girl looked up with bright hazel eyes. "Daddy, is she your friend?" Ethan chuckled softly. "I'm hoping she might become one." Charlotte almost smiled despite herself. She had spent the past decade building Sinclair Global Technologies into one of America's most valuable companies. Politicians sought her endorsement. Billionaires competed for her attention. Magazine covers called her the Iron Queen of Silicon Valley. Yet none of those powerful men had ever arrived carrying a child's tiny pink backpack over one shoulder. The contrast was almost absurd. The hostess awkwardly cleared her throat before leading them toward their table beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Rain tapped gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago while candles flickered. Charlotte Sinclair sat down because walking away suddenly felt less like confidence and more like cruelty. Ethan Brooks did not seem offended by her hesitation, and somehow that made her feel worse. He simply helped his daughter slide her little pink backpack beneath the chair, then folded his own hands on the table as if this expensive restaurant, this awkward situation, and the silent judgment around them were nothing he could not survive. "I should introduce her properly," he said. "This is Lily." The little girl gave a shy wave. "I'm 8.5. Charlotte nodded with unexpected seriousness. "The half matters." Lily smiled. "Exactly." Ethan's eyes warmed with quiet pride. The waiter returned, clearly recognizing Charlotte, but trying not to stare. "Ms. Sinclair, would you prefer your usual private room?" Ethan looked at her for the first time with faint curiosity, not because of her last name, but because of the way the waiter said it. Charlotte answered before the moment grew uncomfortable. "No, this table is fine." The waiter nodded and disappeared quickly. Ethan did not ask why she had a usual private room. He did not lean closer with sudden interest. He simply opened the menu and helped Lily decide between pasta and chicken, reminding her that French fries are not a vegetable, no matter how convincingly you argue. Charlotte found herself almost laughing again. She was used to men performing for her. Polished stories, expensive watches placed where she could notice them, compliments shaped like investments. Ethan performed for no one. When Charlotte asked what he did, he answered plainly, "I build furniture. Mostly tables, cabinets, bookshelves, things people live with." "That sounds peaceful," she said. "Some days. Other days would has more attitude than people." Lily giggled into her napkin. Charlotte watched the way his face changed whenever his daughter laughed, as if the sound repaired something inside him. "And her mother?" Charlotte asked before she could stop herself. Ethan's hand paused briefly beside the water glass. Not long enough to accuse her of being rude. Just long enough for grief to pass through the room like a cold draft. "She passed away 5 years ago," he said. "Cancer." Charlotte's expression softened. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He glanced at Lily, who was now coloring a tiny house on the children's menu. "We learned to keep going." There was no self-pity in his voice, only the worn strength of a man who had carried pain without letting it poison him. Charlotte lowered her eyes to the menu, though she had stopped reading it entirely. Outside, rain shimmered across the Chicago windows, turning the city into streaks of gold and silver. Inside, a billionaire CEO who had spent years surrounded by luxury found herself sitting across from a broke single dad who owned very little, yet somehow gave the room a steadiness she had not felt in years. Then Ethan looked at her gently and asked the one question no man at her level ever asked without strategy. "So, Charlotte, when was the last time you had dinner without checking your phone?" Her hand instinctively moved toward her silent handbag, and for the first time that night, she had no clever answer. Charlotte looked at the phone resting inside her handbag as though Ethan had somehow uncovered a secret she had spent years hiding. She smiled faintly, then slowly pulled her hand away from the bag. "I honestly can't remember," she admitted. "That's probably not a good sign." Ethan offered a gentle nod instead of sympathy. Work has a funny way of convincing us it's more urgent than life. Before Charlotte could respond, Lily proudly held up the children's menu. "Daddy, look, I drew our house." Ethan leaned over with genuine interest. The drawing was simple, a tiny white house with a crooked chimney, a tall tree beside it, and 3 smiling stick figures. Charlotte noticed the third figure had long hair. "Who's she?" Ethan asked with a smile. Lily shrugged innocently. "I don't know yet." Ethan chuckled softly. "Planning ahead?" Lily grinned before returning to her crayons. Charlotte looked away, unexpectedly touched by the child's quiet optimism. At that moment their meals arrived, and the waiter carefully placed each plate before them. Ethan thanked him by name after reading the small embroidered tag on his uniform. "Thank you, Michael." The young waiter looked surprised. "You're welcome, sir." As he walked away, Charlotte asked, "You make a point of remembering people's names?" Ethan sliced Lily's chicken into smaller pieces before answering. "Most people spend their day feeling invisible. Hearing your own name reminds you that someone noticed." Charlotte lowered her eyes. In every board meeting she attended, people remembered her name because of her power. Ethan remembered a stranger's name because of his kindness. The difference lingered quietly between them. "What about you?" he asked. "Do people remember names where you work?" Charlotte hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She had already decided to hide who she really was, hoping for one evening free from assumptions. "Sometimes," she replied. "Mostly they remember job titles." Ethan smiled knowingly. "Titles help people understand what you do. They don't tell anyone who you are." His words settled over the table with unexpected weight. Charlotte thought of the newspaper headlines, the interviews, the awards, the endless introductions that always began with billionaire CEO before anyone mentioned she was simply a woman who often ate dinner alone. Across the restaurant, laughter erupted from a large birthday celebration. Waiters carried out a cake, surrounded by sparklers while guests applauded loudly. Lily watched with wide eyes. "That looks fun." Ethan smiled. "It does." Then, almost without thinking, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a tiny wooden bird no bigger than the palm of his hand. Its wings had been carefully carved and polished smooth. "I finished this during lunch today," he said, placing it beside Lily's plate. "Happy Thursday." Lily gasped as though he had handed her a priceless treasure. "You made this for me?" "Of course." She immediately hugged him around the neck. Charlotte watched in complete silence. She had seen fathers spend thousands of dollars on extravagant gifts for their children while barely looking up from their phones. Ethan had carved a small bird from leftover wood, and somehow it carried infinitely more love than anything money could purchase. Charlotte gently picked up the tiny carving, running her fingers across its smooth surface. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan smiled modestly. Wood remembers every careful touch. People aren't so different. Charlotte looked into his warm hazel eyes, realizing that somewhere between the rain outside, a child's drawing, and a simple wooden bird, the blind date she had almost abandoned was quietly becoming the most meaningful evening she had experienced in years. Charlotte carefully set the tiny wooden bird back on the table as though it were far more valuable than the diamonds resting on her own wrist. Lily immediately placed it beside her drawing of the little white house, declaring with absolute confidence, "Now it has someone to live in the tree." Ethan smiled. Every bird deserves a home. Charlotte noticed he never corrected his daughter, simply because she was imaginative. Instead, he entered her world without hesitation, treating childhood wonder with the same respect most adults reserve for business meetings. The waiter returned to refill their water glasses, but as he reached across the table, another server accidentally bumped his elbow. A glass slipped from the tray, shattered against the marble floor, and icy water splashed across the aisle. Several nearby diners frowned in annoyance. One businessman loudly muttered, "Unbelievable," while another shook his head as if the young waiter had ruined the entire evening. The waiter froze, his face turning pale. Before the restaurant manager could rush over, Ethan quietly stood, picked up Lily's chair to keep her away from the broken glass, then knelt to gather the larger pieces. "Sir, please don't," the waiter said nervously. "We'll take care of it." Ethan smiled gently and stepped back immediately. "You're right. I just wanted to make sure no one got hurt." There wasn't a trace of criticism in his voice. The manager arrived, apologized repeatedly to the surrounding guests, and began reassuring the embarrassed waiter that accidents happened. Charlotte noticed something remarkable. Ethan never looked irritated. He simply waited until the floor was safe before sitting down again, as though kindness required no applause. Across the dining room, the businessman who had complained continued grumbling under his breath. Ethan quietly leaned toward Lily. "See, everyone has difficult days." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "Even grown-ups, especially grown-ups." Charlotte couldn't help smiling. "You always seem to find the gentlest explanation for people." Ethan shrugged modestly. "Most mistakes aren't made by bad people. They're made by tired people." Those words settled deeply inside Charlotte. She suddenly remembered the countless employees she had quietly judged for missed deadlines, imperfect presentations, or nervous mistakes during board meetings. She had rewarded excellence, but how often had she shown grace? As their dinner continued, Ethan noticed an elderly woman at the next table struggling to read the menu under the dim candlelight. Without making a scene, he removed the small reading glasses from his shirt pocket and walked over. "Ma'am, would these help for a moment?" The woman accepted them gratefully, smiling as she finally read the menu clearly. A minute later, she returned the glasses with quiet thanks, and Ethan simply nodded before resuming his meal, as though lending a pair of glasses was no different from passing the salt. Charlotte watched him in silence. Wealth had given her access to extraordinary things: private jets, luxury homes, influence in rooms where history was shaped. Yet sitting across from her was a man whose greatest habit was noticing ordinary people before they had to ask for help. For the first time in many years, Charlotte felt a strange sense of inadequacy. Not because Ethan had more money, power, or success, but because he possessed something infinitely rarer: the quiet instinct to make every person around him feel that they mattered. And somewhere beneath the warm glow of the restaurant lights, without either of them realizing it, admiration was quietly becoming something far more dangerous. The restaurant gradually settled back into its gentle rhythm, the brief interruption already forgotten by most of the guests. But Charlotte Sinclair couldn't stop replaying the quiet moments she had witnessed. Ethan Brooks hadn't tried to impress her once. Every act of kindness had happened before he even realized someone was watching. As dessert menus arrived, Charlotte rested her elbows lightly on the table. "May I ask you something personal?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. "You already have." She smiled. "Fair enough. Why furniture?" Ethan looked toward Lily, who was carefully arranging sugar packets into what she insisted was a tiny city. "Because it gives people second chances," he answered. Charlotte tilted her head. "How so?" He picked up the small wooden bird he had carved earlier and turned it slowly between his fingers. "Most people see an old piece of timber and think it's damaged. I see every scratch, every knot, every crack as part of its story. If you're patient enough, something people were ready to throw away can become the strongest piece in the room." Charlotte listened quietly, feeling as though he was talking about far more than furniture. "Were you always a carpenter?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "No." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Years ago, I studied architecture. I worked for a large design firm in Chicago." Charlotte looked genuinely surprised. "Really? I love designing buildings." His eyes drifted toward Lily again. Then my wife got sick. The warmth in his expression never disappeared, but grief gently settled behind it like an old companion. By the time the treatments ended, I realized I had spent more nights at the office than beside her hospital bed. After she passed away, I promised myself I'd never make that mistake again. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. So you left? Ethan nodded. The promotions, the salary, the long hours, none of it mattered to an 8-year-old girl who only wanted her dad home for dinner. Lily looked up proudly. Daddy makes spaghetti every Tuesday. Ethan laughed softly. Not because I'm a great cook, because it's the only recipe I can't ruin. Charlotte laughed with them, the sound escaping so naturally that she barely recognized it as her own. She couldn't remember the last time laughter had arrived without calculation. She looked at Ethan for a long moment before quietly saying, I told you earlier that I manage a company. Ethan nodded. You did. Charlotte lowered her eyes, deciding to test something she herself didn't fully understand. It's not a very important position. The statement was, of course, completely untrue. She expected curiosity, maybe even relief that she wasn't wealthy. Instead, Ethan simply asked, Do you enjoy working with the people there? Charlotte blinked. That's your question? Shouldn't it be? He replied gently. Money helps pay bills. The people around you determine whether getting up every morning feels worth it. Charlotte stared at him in silence. Every man she had dated had eventually asked about her income, her connections, or her influence. Ethan hadn't asked the name of the company, the size of her office, or even what she earned. He seemed genuinely more interested in whether she spent her days among decent human beings. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, revealing faint reflections of Chicago's skyline beneath clearing clouds. Inside the restaurant, Charlotte realized something both unsettling and beautiful. She had spent years hiding behind titles because titles made people respect her. Ethan had spent one evening reminding her that respect earned without titles was infinitely more precious. The dessert plates had barely been cleared when the check arrived inside a black leather folder. Charlotte reached for it automatically, the movement so natural that she didn't even think about it. For years, every business dinner, charity gala, and executive meeting had ended exactly the same way. She paid. No one argued. It was simply expected. But before her fingertips touched the folder, Ethan gently slid it toward himself. Allow me, he said with an easy smile. Charlotte looked at him in surprise. Ethan, you really don't have to. I know. He opened the folder without hesitation. I want to. Charlotte glanced discreetly at the total and immediately realized it represented a significant expense for someone in his position. This restaurant isn't exactly inexpensive, she said carefully. Ethan smiled. You're right. He reached into his worn leather wallet and removed a debit card that had clearly seen years of use. Behind it, Charlotte caught a brief glimpse of a small family photograph tucked into the transparent sleeve. It showed Ethan, Lily, and a smiling woman whose eyes looked remarkably like her daughter's. He noticed Charlotte looking and smiled. Softly, that's Emma. His thumb rested gently against the photograph before sliding it back into place. Lily insists she stays in my wallet because it means we're still going everywhere together. Charlotte lowered her eyes, suddenly feeling as though she had witnessed something deeply private. Ethan handed the card to the waiter without a trace of hesitation. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply keeping a promise to pay for the evening he had agreed to host. While the payment was processed, Lily leaned closer to her father. Daddy, she whispered, not quite quietly enough, can we still buy strawberries on Saturday? Ethan smiled at her with complete confidence. If they're on sale, absolutely. And if they're not, then we'll make blueberry pancakes instead. Lily considered that for a second before nodding happily. Blueberries are good too. Charlotte felt an unexpected ache in her chest. There had been no disappointment in Lily's voice because she had grown up understanding that happiness was never measured by getting exactly what she wanted. A few moments later, the waiter returned with the receipt and thanked Ethan sincerely before leaving. As the three of them stood to leave, rain continued falling outside, though much lighter than before. Guests gathered near the entrance, waiting for valets to bring their cars around. Ethan helped Lily into her little yellow raincoat, carefully zipping it all the way to her chin before kneeling to tie one loose shoelace. Charlotte watched in silence. The richest men she knew often delegated parenting to nannies, assistants, or private schools. Ethan seemed to treasure every small responsibility that came with being a father. Suddenly his old phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned apologetically. "My neighbor," he explained. "She's checking whether we're almost home." He answered immediately. "Hi, Mrs. Jenkins." "Yes, we're leaving now." "No." Lily remembered her inhaler. "Thank you for checking." After hanging up, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Charlotte smiled. "You have people looking out for you." Ethan nodded. Good neighbors are worth more than expensive houses. Before Charlotte could reply, the restaurant's front doors opened and a sharply dressed man hurried inside out of the rain. He glanced toward the lobby, froze the instant he saw Charlotte, then quickly reached for his phone. Within seconds, another guest did the same. Quiet whispers began moving from table to table. A hostess looked nervously toward the manager. Ethan noticed none of it. He was too busy helping Lily pull on one tiny mitten that refused to cooperate. Charlotte, however, recognized those whispers immediately. They weren't the whispers of curious diners anymore. They were the unmistakable sound of a secret escaping into the world. Charlotte felt the color drain from her face as more phones quietly appeared around the lobby. She had seen this pattern hundreds of times from the other side of the headlines. One person recognized her. Another confirmed it online. Within minutes, curiosity became a story, and a story became breaking news. Ethan finished fastening Lily's mitten before noticing the unusual silence spreading through the entrance. "Everything all right?" he asked. Charlotte forced a reassuring smile that failed to reach her eyes. "Probably just someone recognizing me from a business conference." Ethan accepted the explanation without another question. He had never followed financial magazines or corporate news. His evenings belonged to bedtime stories, homework, and sanding wooden tables until the workshop lights finally went out. Billionaire CEOs existed in a world so distant from his own that he had never imagined one might be sitting across from him at dinner. Just then, the restaurant manager hurried toward Charlotte with a discreet but anxious expression. "Ms. Excuse me." He corrected himself after noticing Ethan nearby. "May I speak with you privately for just a moment?" Charlotte already knew what was coming. She stepped aside while Ethan crouched beside Lily, helping her zip the small pocket on her raincoat. The manager lowered his voice. "There are reporters gathering outside. Someone posted that you're here." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. "How many?" "At least a dozen already. More are arriving." Before she could answer, her phone vibrated repeatedly inside her handbag. She glanced at the screen. Chairman, Head of Security, Chief Communications Officer, Daniel Pierce. The names appeared one after another without stopping. She silenced the phone. Tonight, none of them mattered more than the little girl waiting a few feet away. Ethan looked over with quiet concern. "Bad news?" Charlotte hesitated for only a second. "Work has a way of following me home." Ethan smiled sympathetically. "Then maybe work needs a hobby." She laughed despite herself, the tension easing for a brief moment. Then the restaurant's front doors opened automatically as another guest left, and a burst of camera flashes exploded through the glass like white lightning. Voices echoed from the sidewalk. "Charlotte Sinclair is inside. She's with someone. Get ready." Ethan instinctively turned toward the noise, then immediately looked back at Lily. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms so she wouldn't be frightened by the commotion outside. "Looks like we'll wait until it settles down," he said calmly. Lily wrapped her arms around his neck without fear because her father sounded completely unafraid. Charlotte watched him, her heart tightening with every passing second. He still had no idea those cameras weren't waiting for a celebrity, a politician, or an athlete. They were waiting for her, and by standing beside her, he and Lily had become part of a story they had never chosen. The security team she hadn't called had already arrived, positioning themselves discreetly near the entrance. One of them approached Charlotte. "Ma'am, we need to move now." Ethan heard the respectful tone and finally looked more carefully at the men in dark suits surrounding them. His expression remained calm, but curiosity quietly replaced confusion. He looked back at Charlotte with the same gentle eyes that had never once judged her all evening. "Charlotte," he asked softly, "what exactly is it that you do?" For the first time since they met, she couldn't find a simple answer. Charlotte held Ethan's gaze for several long seconds, silently wishing the question had come under different circumstances. The flashes outside continued bursting through the rain-speckled glass, turning the restaurant entrance into a wall of white light. Reporters shouted her name with growing urgency, while security staff exchanged quick instructions through discreet earpieces. Ethan shifted Lily comfortably in his arms, keeping her little face tucked against his shoulder so she wouldn't be startled by the noise. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He was looking only at Charlotte, patiently waiting for her answer. She took a slow breath. "I wasn't completely honest with you," she admitted quietly. "I told you I managed a company." Ethan nodded once. "You did. The truth is..." Her voice caught for the first time in years. "The company is mine." Ethan frowned slightly, trying to understand. Charlotte continued before she lost her courage. "I am Charlotte Sinclair. I'm the founder and CEO of Sinclair Global Technologies." Silence settled between them, strangely untouched by the shouting outside. Ethan didn't react immediately. He simply looked at her, then at the security officers waiting respectfully a few steps away, then back at the woman who had laughed with Lily over a tiny wooden bird only an hour earlier. Finally, he gave a small nod. "That explains the bodyguards." Charlotte almost smiled, though tears threatened to gather in her eyes. "It also explains the reporters." Ethan glanced toward the entrance where another wave of flashes illuminated the lobby. "I suppose it does." He wasn't angry. He wasn't impressed. He wasn't suddenly nervous. That unexpected calm unsettled Charlotte more than any dramatic reaction could have. "You're not upset that I lied?" she asked softly. Ethan lowered Lily gently to the floor and zipped her raincoat a little higher before answering. "I'm disappointed you felt you had to." Charlotte looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Every time people discover who I am, they start treating me differently." Ethan smiled sadly. "That must get lonely." Those four words struck harder than every headline waiting outside. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. She had spent years protecting herself behind titles, wealth, and carefully controlled appearances. Yet this humble carpenter had recognized the loneliness she had hidden better than anyone else. Just then Lily tugged gently on Charlotte's sleeve. "Are you famous?" she asked with innocent curiosity. Charlotte knelt until they were eye level. "Some people know my name." Lily thought about that for a moment before smiling. "Daddy says names are nice because they help people remember to be kind." Charlotte felt her heart tighten. Ethan laughed softly. "I also said people don't always remember that part." Lily nodded seriously. "Then maybe they should." Before anyone could speak again, the front doors burst open as several reporters pushed past the fur security line. Questions flew through the lobby. "Ms. Sinclair, are you dating the single father? Is this your new relationship? Did you hide him from your shareholders?" Ethan immediately stepped in front of Lily without hesitation, shielding her from the cameras. He raised one hand, not in anger, but in quiet request. "Please," he said calmly, "there is a child here." The words were spoken so gently that, one by one, the reporters lowered their cameras. Even the loudest voices faded into uncomfortable silence. Charlotte watched in amazement. She had employed elite security teams for years, yet none of them had ever cleared a room as effectively as one quiet father protecting his little girl with nothing more than simple dignity. And in that extraordinary silence, Charlotte realized she was no longer afraid of the headlines waiting outside. She was only afraid of losing the man standing beside her. The following morning, every major business network and news website carried the same photograph. Charlotte Sinclair standing beneath the restaurant lights, while modest single father quietly shielded his little daughter from a wall of flashing cameras. Commentators debated her judgment. Financial analysts questioned whether the relationship would distract the CEO of one of America's most influential technology companies. Social media argued over wealth, class, and image without knowing a single truth about the man in the picture. By 9 o'clock, Charlotte was sitting at the head of the long walnut conference table inside Sinclair Global Technologies, surrounded by directors who looked far more concerned about headlines than humanity. One executive leaned forward first. "Charlotte, this situation has become a public relations crisis." Another added, "Investors expect stability, not emotional decisions." Daniel Pierce folded his hands calmly. "Issue a statement. Explain that the dinner was simply a misunderstanding." Charlotte listened without interrupting. When the room finally fell silent, she closed the briefing folder in front of her. "Yesterday evening," she began quietly, "I had dinner with a man who spent more time making sure his daughter felt safe than trying to impress the woman sitting across from him." No one spoke. He thanked every waiter by name. He apologized for accidents that weren't his fault. He protected a child from reporters without raising his voice once. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. Not once did he ask what I owned. Not once did he ask how much money I had. He only asked whether I was happy. Several directors shifted uncomfortably. Daniel finally broke the silence. "With respect, Charlotte, shareholders aren't interested in fairy tales." Charlotte met his gaze without anger. "Perhaps that's the problem." She stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. "For years, we've measured people by market value, influence, and titles. Last night, I met a man who measures people by how they treat strangers, children, and those who can offer them nothing in return." She turned back toward the board. "If being seen with a decent father damages our reputation, then maybe our reputation deserves to be questioned." No one answered. The room fell into complete silence, the kind that arrives when truth is too simple to argue against. Across the city, completely unaware of the meeting, Ethan Brooks swept fresh sawdust from the floor of his small workshop, while Lily carefully painted the tiny wooden bird he had carved the day before. Morning sunlight poured through the workshop windows, filling the room with warm, golden light. His old phone rang. The unfamiliar number appeared again. Ethan answered with his usual calm voice. "Hello." There was a brief pause before Charlotte spoke softly. "I don't know what happens next." Ethan smiled to himself as he watched Lily carefully choose blue paint for the bird's wings. "Neither do I." She let out a quiet breath. "After everything you've learned about me, are you still willing to have that second dinner?" Ethan looked around the little workshop where every table, chair, and bookshelf had been shaped by patient hands. Then he looked at his daughter, who smiled up at him with paint on the tip of her nose. Finally, he answered with the same quiet certainty that had guided every choice he had made since becoming a father. "Charlotte, I agreed to have dinner with a kind woman who laughed at my daughter's jokes and treated her with respect. If she's still the same woman today, then I'd be a fool to say no." On the other end of the line, Charlotte closed her eyes as tears finally escaped after years of refusing to fall. Outside her office, assistants hurried through hallways, investors waited for statements, and television screens continued debating the future of a billionaire CEO. None of it mattered in that moment, because while the world was busy calculating fortunes, two lonely hearts had quietly discovered something infinitely more valuable: the rare courage to choose character over status, kindness over appearance, and love over every expectation the world had ever placed upon them.